Ymedia Group, the fastest growing media group in North America.
वेलकम करना चाहूँगे जी साढ़े ਨਾਲ जुड़ चुकी हैं. We want to welcome Ramona Singh जी. Ramona जी, welcome to Channel Y, Radio Y.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here. And welcome to Ymedia Newsroom. I'm Ramona Singh, and today's top stories, well, as you heard, this war take place since February 28th. Essentially, U.S. President Donald Trump has said that he's going to extend the ceasefire, saying that the Iranian regime is seriously fractured and wants to give Iranian leadership time to come up with a unified proposal for the end of the war plan. Meanwhile, the Iran presidency spokesperson is slamming talks of any division as lies within Iran. When it comes to the U.S. blockades of Iranian ports, that's remaining in place. And the breaking news today has been that Iran's IRGC says that it has captured 2 vessels for disrupting order and safety in the Strait of Hormuz, according to media reports out of Iran. And when it comes to Israel, it has continued its airstrikes on southern Lebanon, demolishing homes despite the 10-day ceasefire. And Hezbollah is responding by launching attacks into northern Israel. So essentially, that is a very shaky ceasefire that was supposed to take another, for 10 days. And when it comes to Canada and US, they're heading towards the high-stakes CUSMA review. The review talks are July 1st, just around the corner. And essentially, the United States is pushing Canada to make concessions before the talks begin. We're going to carry and cover all of those in much more detail. So going to the Iran-US-Israel war. Well, where do things stand? Okay, essentially, President Trump has extended the ceasefire that we were all waiting to see what would happen when the 2 weeks are up from April 7th, when the ceasefire talks began. Essentially, if you recall, Pakistan mediated between the 2 countries, proposing a 10-point plan from the Iran side to the president, and essentially President Trump, posting on his Truth Social that those 10 items are for review, essentially reparations for damages during the 40-plus day war, having nuclear activity, nuclear development, through its enrichment of uranium, essentially ceasefire covering Lebanon, its proxies, because of Hezbollah there, and many more, lifting sanctions on Iran that's been there since 1979. So there were a lot of things that Iran had put forward for end of war ceasefire. Essentially, the first round of talks took place with Vice President J.D. Vance, who was essentially not a main figure in the duration of the war, but essentially, was the person with Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner to lead the talks with the Iranian delegation in Islamabad, Pakistan. Essentially, they said that after 20 plus hours of talks, with now more hard lines from the United States side, essentially saying that no uranium enrichment for Iran, no nuclear weapons, and no uranium enrichment, not even for civilian purposes, for 20 years. Iran came back and said, they could potentially agree to 3 to 5 years. And then the question remained on what to do with the existing enriched uranium in Iran. Then shortly after that, we had President Trump create a blockade of Iranian ports, essentially, saying that Iran is doing its trade and we're going to block it, creating more of, an impact to get Iran back to the table to negotiate. During which time Iran said it's not opening the Strait of Hormuz, which was part of the ceasefire talks that started, from April 7th, essentially saying that Israel is continuing its attacks in southern Lebanon, and that's part of the reason why it's not opening up the Strait of Hormuz. Then you fast forward after, 20 plus hours of the talks between the United States and Iran that came to really no conclusion, but still open to continue the talks. Essentially, right after that, the blockade of Iranian ports took place, and then Iran agreed to opening up the Strait of Hormuz for any civilian vessels. Then when the ceasefire was announced just last week between Israel and Lebanon, to have talks take place in Washington between the 2 nations through their ambassadors, essentially Iran said, great, we welcome that, and the Strait of Hormuz is open. Meanwhile, the blockade continued by the American forces, and what escalated over the past weekend was that there was a cargo ship coming from China to Iran that was intercepted by the American naval forces, and then it was captured. Essentially, we're going to go into detail about what was suspected. If you recall, in the media, there was news about how when the negotiations were taking place, that China was shipping weapons to Iran. And then to which China then responded saying it's not going to do that. So there was suspicion of that. We don't know what was on that cargo, but that escalated things even further with Iran refusing to come to the table for a second round of talks with the United States because they said that it's piracy. And Iran did say that they will retaliate and escalate. It is yet to be seen what that means. So then the 2 weeks deadline was up essentially today. And yesterday, President Trump said that they're going to give more time. This time, not giving a deadline, not 10 days, 5 days, 2 weeks, but essentially an open-ended time by saying that Iran is clearly fractured, given that the Ayatollah was assassinated, Ayatollah Khamenei Sr. on February 28th, with high officials in the Islamic Republic of Iran's regime. And so therefore the president's saying they're fractured and we're going to give them time. And that J.D. Vance is not on his way, which is what he had said that, his American delegation was on its way. So this is where we are at today in terms of what this means. Now, this extension is open-ended, saying that until the discussions are concluded. We don't really know where that stands. But at the same time, the U.S. naval blockade of Iran will remain fully in place. And Iran has not committed to talks, leaving the negotiation essentially in limbo. And meanwhile, the ceasefire continues, meaning there's no bombing happening between United States, Iran, and Israel, with those two nations essentially, U.S. and Israel bombing Iran and Iran bombing Israel, as well as the GCC countries. That ceasefire is, in effect, but there's actually no progress in terms of what this peace looks like, so what this negotiation looks like. And it looks like this war has kind of gone over to the seaway between naval ships, which is what we've seen escalating in the past few days. Now, the start of the ceasefire talks, which was on April 7th, the U.S. has paused those military strikes. And meanwhile, Pakistan is still saying, we're ready to host a second round of talks. Pakistan has, blockaded roads, launched 20,000 security service people to be able to make sure the capital is secure for talks. But right now we don't have a date and time. So at the same time, the U.S. is still enforcing its full economic and naval blockade. So that's clearly the case. And now Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps have now, this is breaking news as of a few hours ago, saying that they've fired and seized 2 ships. Okay. And then damaged a 3rd vessel, claiming that these ships violated rules and endangered maritime security. The vessels were part of a convoy linked to MSC, which is the world's largest shipping company. So given that it's a private company, so 2 vessels have been seized and a 3rd one has been damaged. This is the latest that's coming out. Of course, we're going to cover the details once we know more on this story. But essentially, what we're hearing now is that some of these vessels that are going into this region of the Strait of Hormuz, which is essentially the Gulf of Oman to the Strait of Hormuz to the Persian Gulf, well, they've turned off some of their tracking corresponders to be able to cross the Strait of Hormuz. Essentially, if you recall, during this 40-plus day war, Iran, when they closed off the Strait of Hormuz, was essentially charging about $2 million for ships to pass and providing them security. And so when the cargo ship that left China that was heading to Iran got seized, essentially showed that Iran cannot provide the security that it said it could. And now you see what it's doing with those 3 ships, 2 seized, 1 damaged of MSC, kind of is asserting their position in the Strait of Hormuz to be able to create what would be, insurance to have vessels pass the Strait of Hormuz. So this is developing, but it doesn't mean, we're getting any close to having talks on between these two countries as well as Israel to having peace and stability and security when it comes to the regional aspect of things. If you can imagine, the GCC countries have been highly affected with their production of oil, with their output of oil. It's affecting their local economies. And then, of course, the Strait of Hormuz being a critical artery for 20% of the world's oil. So during this time, the U.S. forces have turned back 28 vessels for their blockade of Iranian ports. And essentially, and up to now, they've already seized 2 Iranian ships. That was the cargo from China, and a second one in the open waterway. So escalation has definitely moved from airstrikes to water, it seems. So now Iran's response is that they're essentially saying that because of the US blockades, they're saying that there's no difference from bombardments, aerial strikes that have taken place in that 40-day war, and essentially calling it a military response for what they've seen as an escalation point. And Iran is ready to take the initiative, warning that they will retaliate and escalate. So we've yet to see how else they're going to escalate things. We could play out a few scenarios of how this could escalate, of course. Now, the talks are uncertain and it's not formally confirmed by Tehran. There's no date. There's no date of when this talks are supposed to take place. There's no date in terms of when the ceasefire is supposed to end. And really, the conditions of the ceasefire haven't really been met, other than that there's no airstrikes amongst these countries. And so right now, in that sense, the fighting has been paused, and the confrontation, as we said, has continued to the sea. So the bottom line is that it's not a de-escalation; it's more of a controlled standoff with rising risks, right? So essentially, the real tension is that there could be, really serious strains, of course, in the Iranian government. We know that, because of their provinces, the way they do things is once the attacks occurred on February 28th, essentially all the provinces, started their own offensive attacks and, not having a centralized system. So we saw this take place with, the US jets that were shot down, if you recall, and essentially what that was all about. And we've heard now allegations come out of the White House that, Trump has, there's strain within his administration. And there's even been from sources saying that during that time when the US jets were shot down, that President Trump was kept out of key war room discussions, according to some of those insiders, saying that Trump was screaming at aides, essentially feeling that he's lost control of the narrative of this war or where it's heading because of what we're seeing take place and the mismanagement and essentially that goalpost changing, right? It was supposed to be a regime change to, removing the enriched uranium out of Iran, possibly a, boots on the ground operation, to then opening up the Strait of Hormuz, and then the 10 points that was presented from Iran to President Trump that he said could be negotiated, to then no enrichment of uranium for 20 years, to now no talks scheduled, right? So, and essentially what's happening is this strategy has been highly inconsistent with Trump's threats on escalation, and then essentially in the same sentence on his post saying that they're very close to a deal, or JD Vance is on his way to Islamabad for a round of talks. Meanwhile, there wasn't a scheduled round of talks. So there's that erratic and what you would call, I guess, a reactive way of responding to this war, and the strategy shifting rapidly. If you recall, then at the same time, President Trump would say, the end of a civilization, it's going to be power plant bridge day in terms of bombing civilian infrastructure, and then going back to saying, no, a deal can be done. This is all going to be over in no time. So essentially, it's been a lot of different things that the market has been reacting to, with spikes on the cost of oil, going above, 110 per barrel. So it's definitely shifted over and over again. Essentially, there's a clash between what would be military versus political goals, right? Because what we've seen in this conflict is you have airstrikes on nuclear sites, you had ongoing blockades, you had failed or stalled talks, and then essentially intelligence reports have shown that nuclear program has been either likely delayed or not destroyed, even though there was airstrikes on the nuclear sites. And also, intelligence reports have shown that there isn't any nuclear weapons, although there is enriched uranium that could convert to to nuclear weapons. So there's been a lot of things that have been going around in terms of the media and the reaction to it. And of course, the EU standoff, and now you have British and French naval ships in that area as well, trying to keep the coast clear for the vessels. So there's a lot of activity that is happening there. But really, what's happening is now there's that clash between military versus the global political goals, right? The political goals are very clear for Trump, where essentially he wants to make sure that he has the political optics, the narrative, forcing a deal to show that, he did a deal, he created peace, and it was a better deal than the Obama deal. And, perhaps now avoiding a full war. We know that numbers were about $1 billion a day were spent on this war from the United States. And we know that's been a highly unpopular war, according to MAGA, as well as the American public. So you have that. Meanwhile, the military needs to have a clear, consistent objective of what it's doing. Like right now in the Strait of Hormuz, in the Iranian ports, it needs to have a clear objective of, are we seizing ships? Are we turning them away? Are we going to stay here? What is the objective which is, from a military standpoint, given that, boots on the ground is not an option, given that the jets over Iran was not an option, if you recall that, with them being shot down. And so there's a couple of those inconsistencies that are taking place. Essentially, we're seeing a pivot, right? We're seeing that the United States may be shifting from what we saw in the direct escalation with Iran. And we've seen President Trump try this whole, pressure and try to negotiate. But unfortunately, when it applies the pressure on Iran, Iran doesn't come back to negotiate. So that's been firing back at him. That's been very successful with other nations when it comes to, whether it's war or whether it's tariffs or whether it's trade agreements. And, we've seen that leadership style from President Trump come really under scrutiny during this time, essentially, with insiders saying that, and of course, just not insiders, but I guess the public in general and us, the media saying, it seems to be like a knee-jerk reaction of decision making, and his level of leadership throughout this entire time has been very, very erratic. So, of course, we're going to break down what could potentially happen in these round of talks, and when we want to look at the China angle, for example, right? So that was the critical thing. Trump had suggested that China may be supplying Iran weapons directly, right? Oh, sorry, indirectly. And we heard those reports that the ships were going to Iran during the ceasefire talks, right? Essentially, could it be that each side is preparing to go back into full-scale war? Now, the ship reportedly had been linked to Chinese ports or routes. That had the cargo ship that was seized by the American troops. China has denied supplying weapons to Iran, essentially, after that report was out, saying that they have no plans of such, even though this concern was expressed by the United States. So this creates a tension between US, China, and we know that the two world leaders, China and US, are to meet next month. So what does it mean before their meetings, right? And the question still remains. So what was exactly on that ship, that cargo ship that was seized by American forces, that was coming from China to Iran? And, was there any military equipment on there? What was there exactly to prove whether China is now getting involved in this fashion, which could change the dynamics completely into a three-power geopolitical situation, right? So if we want to look at, what are the best case scenarios that could play out? We know we don't have an end to the ceasefire talks, and we know we don't have a second round of talks taking place, no schedule as such. But let's play out some of these scenarios of the best case scenario, right? That could happen. It would be a controlled de-escalation, right? Which would be essentially back channel talks where you have Pakistan as well as perhaps the Gulf countries mediating. Maybe Oman gets in there as well and starts talking, to Iran and starts talking to the United States and gets the two parties back to the table. Now, there's also Iran issuing strong rhetoric, but imagine in a best case scenario that it would limit its response. So, not claiming retaliation or responding to US bullying, but essentially keeping that back, escalated further back. And in the best case scenario, you'd have US avoid further ship seizure and Iran avoid further ship seizure. Essentially, the blockade to be lifted on those ports, and to have on both sides Iran agreeing to having the Strait of Hormuz open for what was normal activity prior to this war starting on February 28th. Now, some of the signals to be watching for this best case scenario would essentially be, seeing Iran having a delayed reaction and in terms of responding to the United States. Essentially seeing President Trump, tone down his language when it comes to destroying bridges and nuclear power plants, essentially, or ending a civilization. And going back to what was diplomacy, right? Having perhaps the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, head this up, or someone that could be a little bit more diplomatic in their language, and having, a meeting that would be confirmed, and that would essentially send a positive, news to the world watching this play out. And of course, not to mention what the reaction of the markets would be. What would be the outcome? It would be oil stabilizing, or maybe the price also dropping. It would be a proper ceasefire, meaning no attacks, from seizing ships to blockading, to Israel and Hezbollah not attacking one another. It would mean that. And what it would mean that talks could resume, and we would have some sort of an understanding of what is to play, what is this agreement, and have a end of war agreement, and the escalation will be contained. Diplomacy will be back in play. Then there's a middle case scenario, right? It would be what would be like managing what this tension is that we're seeing between the two countries, right? In this case, Iran would respond in a way of what would be symbolic, right? Essentially saying that there's harassment of ships, drone activity, proxy pressure, not essentially direct war. The US would continue its blockade enforcement, which is kind of where we're at right now, right? If you look at it, we're in this middle ground tension where Iran is saying, we will not be bullied, we will not have a shadow of threat to come to negotiations. Iran is saying all of that. It is what it's doing in terms of intervening on ships. And then you have the proxy pressure, what we're seeing right now, Hezbollah attacking northern Israel, and Israel continuing its attacks in southern Lebanon. And then you have the US blockades. This is where we're at. We're in this middle ground, which essentially is, minor in the Gulf region compared to what this 40-day war was. And even though there's no direct US-Iran strikes against each other, which is the positive side, and there's still a window of potentially both sides coming to the table. Essentially, what's the outcome of this middle ground we're in? Oil is still volatile. It's going in, it could go anywhere from 90 to almost 100, maybe a little over $100 per barrel range, right? But we're at that $98 per barrel range. We're close to that 100 mark. And then shipping is, of course, slowing down, but it hasn't stopped completely like we saw during the escalation, the height of this war. And, talks are delayed, but they're not dead. So it essentially means the conflict has simmered down and there's no full-scale escalation, right? We could go now to what would be a high-risk case. Essentially, this would be a regional escalation that we saw take place. This would be Iran retaliating. It's saying that it's going to retaliate to the blockade of, U.S. naval on its Iranian ports. It's going to retaliate to the seizure of the cargo ships. So that would essentially mean, what would this be? The next step would be, if Iran does retaliate, it could attack U.S. naval assets. It could, continue what we saw today, which we're kind of landing on, which is seizure of Western ships. That's the breaking story of just happened, within the last few hours. And then the U.S. responding militarily. This essentially would mean we're talking about missiles, drones, strike, activity, and U.S. increasing its military posture, perhaps sending more military to the area, and essentially this would be a time where they would call for allies to evacuate, and the outcome would be that the Hormuz would be definitely disrupted. There would be more of a chokehold on it. Oil prices will spike over $110 per barrel, and the ceasefire will completely collapse. And of course, the GCC countries will be in the open line of fire, sharing that Persian Gulf, Strait of Hormuz way with Iran, and as a retaliation, Iran targeting those GCC country military bases, the American military bases. So that would be, a third level escalation. Now, if we were talking about a worst case scenario, would be a global escalation, and this would include the China factor, right? Because of the suspicions of the United States on the role China's playing. Essentially, if you can imagine, it would be, if there was, because they seized that cargo coming from China to Iran, it would be, if there's any evidence emerging that China was and is knowingly supplying Iran weapons, and if this is something that could be proven, perhaps what was seized on that ship or any other intelligence in the area, U.S. escalating its rhetoric or sanctions. Not only it has it on Iran, but now including China. Well, then China would go into a situation where China will defend its position diplomatically, and then there is a massive tension between the two countries, U.S. and China. That spiking, of course, that's going to affect trade, security issues, and everything else. You would then see strong warnings coming out of Beijing. You would see strong warnings as a reaction from what we would hear from the European Union, from Russia, Canada, somewhere in the middle of that, and that would just definitely affect the global markets. It would react very sharply. There would be trade tensions, and the military tensions would overlap. And of course, we're talking about a full scale back into war. Luckily, we're not there. We're right now sitting in that second scenario, heading towards the third scenario that I described, but hopefully we're going to be able to walk back to the best case scenario. So we are in a dangerous middle zone, too much escalation, essentially to ignore, but it's not enough yet to trigger a full conflict that we saw take place in those 40 days. So essentially the next move is from Iran. We're all waiting to see what Iran is going to do. Is it going to come back to the table, or is it going to escalate the situation in response to President Trump? So those are the things that we're watching for. Of course, this is a developing situation, and we're going to bring you the latest on all of those things. Now, when it comes to the region of what's happening, just this week, the European Union foreign ministers met up, and then there was a proposal. The proposal, which was rejected, was a call to suspend their trade agreement with Israel. So Israel is getting a backlash from other countries based on what they've seen take place in Gaza, and the European Union is no different. So this proposal was pushed by Spain, Ireland, and Slovenia. And essentially, the reasons they gave is that because of the allegations of the war crimes and human rights violations in Gaza, they said that they would like to terminate the trade agreement with Israel. But there is no, because that was struck down, the proposal failed due to lack of support. Essentially, what we're seeing is that there's a divide within the European Union. Those countries such as Spain, Ireland, and Belgium wanted this action, right, to take place, as well as Slovenia. And the countries that blocked it were Germany and Italy. And if you recall, Italy just suspended its defense pact with Israel. But when it comes to the trade agreement with Israel, Italy and Germany blocked the motion to suspend this agreement. Essentially, what was proposed of suspending this trade deal would require what would be a unanimous agreement, right? So all the countries who are part of the European Union would have to agree to suspend this trade agreement. Those are the implications of doing such. And because two countries were against it and it was not unanimous, therefore it could not pass. But this is what's been created, right? Now there's two camps inside the European Union. One is they want serious sanctions and suspensions on Israel, saying that essentially the European Union's credibility is at stake. And then there is the camp that wants to engage with Israel by saying that, you know what, they rather dialogue, not punishment, which would be punishment. It would be a sanction if there's no trade agreement with Israel. And then believing that the sanctions won't change Israel's reaction. So they're saying that since Israel's not going to stop, what's happening in Gaza, West Bank, Southern Lebanon, essentially, what would be the point of going through the sanction, but instead let's have a dialogue with them, right? So essentially this divide is stalled between the European Union nations. Essentially, the European Union is Israel's largest trading partner. We're talking about 40 to 45 billion euros annually. And the agreement was in effect since 2000. And what this means is it governs trade, political relations, and the proposal could impact billions of dollars in exports. And essentially, the pushback there, where it really started the division within the European Union countries, is that over 1 million Europeans signed a petition calling for a suspension. And really, what's at risk here is that critics are saying this is showing that European Union is not enforcing its own human rights clauses. If you know, European Union is a huge on human rights violations, even when it comes to the tech sector, right? We know that the European Union has launched many lawsuits against big tech for when it comes to invasion of privacy, data collection. We know that it stood on its sanctions against Russia when it came to the invasion of Ukraine. So what the critics are saying is that, hey, European Union, what is happening here in terms of your ethics on human rights when it comes to a trade agreement that sees, tens of billions of dollars going to Israel, and really, and then we're not even talking about the defense budget that goes to Israel, right? During all of the stuff that's happening, that's been really hard to essentially for a lot of nations to look away from based on what has happened in Gaza, when we're talking about 70,000 plus people who've been killed in that region, and what's taking place over and over again. So now the EU is in a place where it's divided on this Israel policy, right? Essentially, no unified foreign policy stance on this, and this internal politics is really shaping this external policy of having a massive reaction from people, citizens of the European Union, and essentially asking the question of, like, what does the European Union stand for if it doesn't stand for basic human rights that imposes on other nations, imposes within the European Union, it imposes it on its citizens, and only has trade relations on those bases. So where is that morality clause is the question. That is the case. Now, Israel has right now avoided economic consequences for now. But it is seeing trade relationships stay intact, but it is seeing some detractors in the past little while, as we've seen even this war take place. We've seen South Korea respond to Israel. We've seen the European Union as well as Canada respond when the ceasefire took place on April 7th to say that that does also include Lebanon, and that was by Prime Minister Mark Carney as well. So we'll see where that goes in terms of the tension that is taking place. Now, when it comes to the latest news on President Trump's cabinet, the latest is that U.S. Labor Secretary Lori Chavez de Remer has resigned. That is his labor secretary, and the resignation comes amid widening ethics and misconduct allegations and an investigation that's taking place. There she is with her husband. That is their Facebook post. And essentially, this probe, it includes workplace behavior allegations, misuse of resources, and controversies involving her inner circle and her husband. Essentially, there's been mounting pressure from multiple allegations that have forced her exit. So essentially, she is the third cabinet minister to resign, and they've only been in power for a little over a year. And so, taking office last year in January. So essentially, a little over a year after, there was, of course, all the Senate hearings and they were sworn in. So a very short period of time to have three of your cabinet ministers be out. But this investigation was triggered by a whistleblower complaint. Essentially, the allegations included drinking at workplace, improper workplace relationships, and misuse of taxpayer-funded travel. The allegations also involved her husband being accused of inappropriate conduct with staff. No criminal charges have been filed. Essentially, these claims are disputed by legal representatives, and essentially, these are allegations under investigation. It has not been legally proven. But this is coming after you saw Kristi Noem, who was Homeland Security Secretary. She was fired in March of this year. Then Pam Bondi, who was Attorney General, she was ousted in April. So it's like one after another in just a few weeks, right? We're having the third one. Now, the narrative is a little bit different on this one, even though it's showing a little bit of dysfunction within Trump's cabinet and his picks. But when it comes to this cabinet official, essentially the narrative is that she is going to be going into the private sector, and that's how so it's not necessarily she's been fired or ousted, but she's essentially leaving to go to the private sector. Now, there is this recurring thing. We're going to cover what's the latest with Kash Patel, but her strategic resignation is that, it seems like it was pressure driven to exit because of these investigations that are taking place. But now she's saving face because she's going to the private sector. Now, moving on to Kash Patel, the director of FBI, essentially a big story was really revealed about him in The Atlantic. And now he's responding to that story that was dropped in The Atlantic with a $250 million lawsuit against the media company. Now, this lawsuit claims that this recent article about him, which he says is false, it was defamation and essentially a malice hit piece is what he's calling it, because the article alleged that he is, there's reports that he has excessive drinking, erratic behavior, and that he is sometimes missing meetings and has unexplained absences, essentially saying Kash Patel is MIA. And there's stories within that article about how, everybody at the FBI is essentially waiting for him to be fired. And there was a situation where he couldn't log into his account at the FBI account, and he, essentially got really upset, wondering if he was fired, and there was escalations of that. If you read the article, there's all kinds of stories that The Atlantic has written by saying that these are people that reported, on Kash Patel. And so this is a response from him. And so this $250 million lawsuit is essentially based on these allegations that he's saying is, defamation. And the article based it on 20 anonymous sources, raising concerns about his behavior. So what does that mean, right? Essentially, is this actual malice? Because there's a high bar when it comes to public officials in terms of how you can report around them because they're in the public eye. Now, Patel's position is that the story was completely fabricated, that it was politically motivated to get him out, and saying that the outlet essentially ignored his denial as well as request for more time to respond, essentially saying that the outlet, The Atlantic, really just wants to, create a political assassination of sorts, right? In terms of like on his name, on his brand, on his influence. And what he's now doing with this lawsuit, $250 million lawsuit, is he wants to clear his name and punish media outlets, right? To let them know, hey, anyone else who's thinking about writing about me this way, you're going to be seen with this type of a lawsuit, right? Now, mind you, The Atlantic, probably, of course, their editors and their lawyers reviewed this piece before it was released, and they're willing to go ahead with it. They're saying that they stand by their lawsuit. They stand by the reporting. They will fight the lawsuit, and saying that the report is based on credible sources, essentially defending their journalism and their credibility. So this is the case. Now, what is the big deal here, right? Like, what could be the possible outcome? It is very hard for a lawsuit, this type of lawsuit, to be won, right? Because public figures must prove that the outlet knew it was false or ignored truth deliberately, is the basis of what needs to be proved. And most defamation cases really fall aside. Now, President Trump was successful, if you recall, with his lawsuit with media companies, as well as what he did with almost Facebook. And if you recall, those were settled very, very quickly. And that created a Trump, because we know that Melania right now has a lawsuit out for Ymedia, as well as now Kash Patel. So there is a trend that is taking place, which usually was covered by SLAPP laws. And what is SLAPP law is essentially that if you're a public figure, then people can, media can write about you because you've essentially put yourself out there. But this piece is a serious one. If you do take a look at it, it's from The Atlantic, and essentially it's taking a look at his leadership style, saying that there's instability within the FBI. It is politically explosive, especially for President Trump, given that this would be his fourth cabinet member that he had brought in to serve in his second administration that could potentially be on his way out if this actually escalates. We'll see what President Trump does. But, there was a lot of questions around, his cabinet picks, like, were they qualified for these positions? And if they're not qualified for these positions and they're Trump loyalists, and they only have these positions because of their loyalty to Trump and Trump putting them there, then how beholden are they to Trump? Part of Kash Patel's file has been to show that, the 2020 elections, were not what they were supposed to be, in terms of that when Biden won that election and Trump lost that election for his second term, that there was allegations of, a lot of issues in that election. Essentially, Trump has always said that it was stolen from him. Now, all those cases have been thrown out of court, but essentially, Kash Patel has said that he's got the receipts, he's got the evidence, and it's going to be shown. So there is that question when the Senate hearings took place, that how credible are these people for these massive roles in the American government, and are they qualified, and what are their experiences? So essentially, this is one of the latest that we're going to, of course, cover for you in terms of what this means.